This video focuses on significant congressional legislation, laws passed by Congress intended to reduce racial inequality that existed in the United States. So, the important thing to understand about some of the laws I'm going to show you is that there's a definite connection between citizen action and government action. In many cases, it's the protests that were led, especially during the civil rights movement in the 1960s, that really kind of motivated or forced the government into taking necessary action. So there's that definite connection between the citizens placing pressure on the government to pass these laws. So one of the most impactful marches, demonstrations in American history was in August of 1963. This was the famous March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where hundreds of thousands of individuals descended upon the nation's capital, protesting all sorts of different types of racial discrimination that existed in this country. This march culminated with Dr. King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And this march, right, along with others and demonstrations, placed a tremendous amount of pressure on the government to pass a law like the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So that's President Johnson, Dr. King sort of like standing over his shoulder, watching him sign this impactful legislation. But what this legislation does is it ends all remaining elements of what we call de jure segregation. So this is like legally enforced segregation that is established by law. And if you break the law, you deal with the consequences, the criminal consequences. So think about like somebody like Rosa Parks, who sits on part of a bus that is not designated for African Americans and is arrested for basically violating that local ordinance or that law. That's de jure segregation. It's segregation that's established by law, and anybody that breaks that law is punished like you would be for breaking any law. So that's what's eliminated by the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It's important to note, right, that Brown v. Board ended segregation in public schools 10 years earlier. But that case is like hyper focused. It only dealt with the inequity, the unfairness of segregation in public schools. It didn't deal with segregation in any other area of society. That would come a decade later with this 1964 Civil Rights Act. It's also important to note that the 64 Civil Rights Act, though it is monumentally impactful in ending all remaining elements of de jure segregation, it doesn't necessarily address de facto segregation. So de facto segregation still exists, unfortunately, today, and it's segregation without the enforcement of law. So the New York Times did something pretty interesting in 2019, and they tried to make a point that society was still fairly segregated for 2019, right? And what they did is using census data, they kind of like mapped out where people lived to see if there were sort of if there's segregation that still existed without legal enforcement today, right? Do people still live largely in segregated communities? And their data showed that this was a thing, right? If you look and see where each of the groups lives, you can see kind of like the visual like grouping, right? This is Philadelphia, this is New York in 2019, this is Boston, this is Los Angeles, and this is Baltimore. And one of the things they were trying to show, and they felt like these maps show, is that people are largely living in, again, segregated communities, right? The difference is that obviously today it's not de jure segregation. There's no law that basically promotes this currently, right? There's no legal enforcement of this. So the question is like, why does this happen? Right. And I think what it's important to note is that de facto segregation, which exists today and is not enforceable by law, is usually a byproduct of like segregation that was once legal. So, like for example, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, was a product of like the New Deal in the 1930s. And one of the things that this government organization did is it color coded neighborhoods for mortgage companies, basically indicating to mortgage companies how risky the people living in those communities would be to lend money to. The communities that are shaded in blue and green were considered the least dangerous to lend money to. Oftentimes, these were where white people lived in larger concentrations. The areas coded in red, this is largely where African Americans lived, and they were basically coded red, or they're outlined in red. So the practice became known as redlining. These communities were deemed to be the riskiest to lend money to. So once World War II ends and one of the things that happens is the suburbs explode and people want to move out of the cities. It's much easier for people living in the communities shaded in blue and green to go to a mortgage company, get a home loan, and move out to the suburbs, right? Those living in the red areas, they're outlined in red, the redlining practice, they were deemed to be the riskiest, and mortgage companies would not lend individuals, predominantly African Americans in these communities, access to mortgages, and they wouldn't lend them home loans. This allowed largely white individuals to move out to the suburbs, and kept many African American communities sort of like within like the inner city limits. So again, this practice ended a long time ago, and there is no more legalized segregation. But the after effects of these once legal policies can't just be brushed away, right? They last for a long time. So oftentimes, de facto segregation needs to be looked at as a byproduct of once de jure segregation.